this being a well-cited researcher, you can poo-poo that if you want, but it's, to me, I am happy about it because I failed school. I was playing pinball and punk music and shoplifting, and so I didn't do so well. But fortunately, in Sweden we have a grown-up school, so I could go there, and when I was mature enough. But maybe it wasn't just my maturity, maybe it was the system also, the school system. Let's blame that. Yeah, I just want to say also that sorry I missed yesterday. My son had his birthday, and I wanted to be there, and but I do love sort of listening into the whole conference and sort of pick up on the things I hear and so on. I'll try to do that a little bit today, and also I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and so I have to do this in my second language, so you can imagine, right? So I'll do my best. Yeah. No more disclaimers. All right. So yeah. So I'm going to talk about transformation, and I, for example, share like a lot of like Sharon's background. You know, being I call it the pracademic. I think, like an academic that also do a bit of practice. So, but I think I'll focus a lot on the academic side. I'm going to talk about coming from a transformation research background. I'm going to talk about a lot of the issues that have been raised here, but from this sort of resilience, transformation, social, ecological systems perspective. So you recognize most of it, but maybe from a slightly different angle. So there is a lot of talk about transformation at the moment, and which is good. And we have it in the UN system, we have it in the social movements, we have it among a lot of big companies, for example, and the startup community. And so it's great that we talk about transformation, and that because there is a realization in there somewhere, and sometimes, that the systems that we have created for the food system, energy system, economic system are producing toxic outcomes in form of injustice and unsustainability. So I'm really happy about it. I've been doing this type of research for about 25 years on transformation. So, and I have never seen such an interest in the concept before, and not just transformation, but also systems thinking. So that's why I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me, because I think it's super important right now to fill that space of interest from a lot of actors, and help with the what we can do in that space, and what we can contribute with. So that's why I'm also really happy to be here and with you. And some of you I've seen only in 2 dimensions, so it's really nice to see you in real life. So great that we talk about transformation. I think there's a couple of things that I would just sort of push when it comes to sort of helping that field and helping that interest. Is one thing that we need to talk about is what is transformation. So that I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And also I'm going to talk about what's the role of crisis and disturbance in transformation dynamics. I think we talk too little about that. And then I'm going to talk about the capacities that we need to transform. So if we start with what is transformation? And from a resilience perspective, we talk about 3 different responses to disturbance. So it's coping, adaptation, and transformation. And here I brought in mitigation also, because it's one of these concepts that we use a lot when we talk about change. So if mitigation is more about doing less harm, and you have some example there from climate change, for example, reforestation to capture CO2, so do less harm. Adaptation is the ability to deal with disturbance and external shocks, etc., and stay on track. While transformation is in the same sort of circumstances, it's about the ability to change track when we realize the systems that we created needs to change. So it's about changing the system that created the problems in the first place. And also, I think that this separation is important, because we need to talk about transformation and we need to talk about things that are broader than climate change. And I'm saying this or highlighting this because I think that the narrative on how we deal with the environmental challenges has been for decades dominated by adaptation to climate change, adaptation to climate change. So that means that we've been focusing on one type of change, but also climate change as a single problem. And then we've been talking about also single solutions. So I'll talk about the sort of the need to complexify that. So if we go into how we define transformation and how we've been defining it over the years, transformation involves a fundamental shift in practices, but also in rules and regulations, but also in deeper values and worldviews. And you recognize this from, and that's why I put the iceberg, because you recognize this from Donella Meadows' work. It really is these different leverage points. So we say that, of course, you need to change behavior and practices, but those behaviors and practices are embedded in rules and regulations, which in turn is embedded in our world, in our worldviews and values. So it has to happen on all these levels. But change also has to happen, as many people here have talked about, in different dimensions of society. So you have, for example, a fundamental shift in resource flows, how, for example, money is flowing, who gets what and how, roles and routines, who is doing what and how. And this is a sort of a tragic and comic picture that is not very unusual. It's a map panel at the Global Summit of Women. Yeah, and it's not 100 years ago, it's 2014. And which also, of course, raises questions about who's doing what and how. But then also the power issue that several of you have talked about, like who is deciding what and how. So a fundamental shift in all these dimensions is important. But also then coming from a social ecological perspective, the relationship to the planet is also important, and that we change, fundamentally change. So we're talking a lot about, right now, it's no longer possible nor desirable to address the dual challenges of equity and sustainability separately, because that's what we've done historically, right? And that's why I like, as many of you, like the concept of regenerative development, right? And maybe I like it better than sustainable development, because it really brings back this into it, that sustainability has lost, I think. And can be in one of these valleys, and it can be very hard to change it because there's self-reinforcing feedbacks that keeps that system there. But sometimes it becomes possible then to push that ball or rock across some kind of threshold or tipping points. It's very popular to talk about these days. And you're able to roll this ball into another valley where you have a new set of feedbacks. And that's what you talked about, Sharon, the feedbacks. So this is basically changing from one feedback system to another one. And sorry, if I have a clicker, I can bring it with me, right? So this is also the sort of the picture or the theory that we use for understanding the role of crisis. So, for example, the crisis, the oil crisis in 1973, it helped lower the threshold for, in some Dutch cities, moving from a car-based society to a bike infrastructure. And it's interesting to start to think about what happened before the crisis and what happened after the crisis, and also what happened during the crisis. So here, for example, after the World War II, the car became sort of dominant in society and started to choke the cities. There was some social movement starting that saw this as a problem. They saw the problem with that there was congestion, but also that a lot of people died in traffic accidents, and especially a lot of children died in traffic accidents. So there was a campaign called Kindermord that people worked with in the 60s. And then came the crisis, which opened up decision makers and others to try to find another sort of alternative approach to urban development. And as this movement then have been pushing and pushing, and suddenly there was a possibility to test some of the ideas that they had suggested, for example, car-free streets and car-free days, etc. You recognize this from some of your own cities, maybe, and which then sort of was the experiments that created the ideas and that made the new system and alternative approaches starting to stick and become the new normal. So it's really interesting to see how we can start to talk about that. Maybe there are different phases of a transformation, and that you have a preparation phase and a navigation phase after some kind of disturbance or crisis happening, where it's possible to push it over a threshold. But then you also have a stabilization phase where the new system is formed. So this is what we've been developing and using to understand the different capacities that you need in these different phases. So I'll talk a bit more about that. Because we can take a couple of other examples. And here we have the role of the Boxing Day tsunami in Southeast Asia, and how in Indonesia, in Sumatra, in the Aceh province, it lowered the threshold for moving from a conflict situation between the separatists and the government to a peace process. That still holds today. But in Sri Lanka, then also hit by the same tsunami, had a similar conflict between the separatists and the government. There, the conflict intensified. So that sort of raises the question: what happened in Indonesia then that could explain some of the success there? So there's a lot written on, and I won't go into this in detail, but there's a lot written on this. And one of the things that is put forward in Indonesia is that the parties had developed a readiness to take the step when the crisis came. So, and then afterwards, the foreign aid money, the relief money, etc., was used to strengthen the peace process. While in Sri Lanka, the parties were not that close to taking the step, and the foreign money was used to buy weapons and other things, and to intensify the conflict. So I think it's useful. I think it's interesting, and I think it's useful to put the role of crisis into sort of thinking about transformation, because I think it triggers us to think about a little bit different about the capacities that are needed. And this is a bit of a messy picture. The phases of preparing, navigating, and stabilizing, and also put in the role of crisis. There could be a social political shock. That's what we put in here. But it could also be an ecological crisis. And what you see here is that it's interesting to see where in the transformation process a crisis can sort of hit, and also how it can play a different role then in different phases of a transformation. So it can trigger, maybe an ecological crisis triggers the niche building and the networkings forming to then develop a readiness and a maturity that could be used then when another crisis hits, in this case, a socio-political shock, so that it opens up for these ideas that have been in the niches to actually become the new normal and be institutionalized. So I think this is just the way that we work when we analyze our cases. And in this paper, we analyze the socio-political shocks in Chile, Uzbekistan, and South Africa. So what we're working on right now is to first move away from call it an opportunity, because it's not, it's problematic to talk about opportunity in times of human suffering. So I think that I'm a bit sloppy about that, so I try to be better. But there's also a lot of sayings, you know, that like never waste a good crisis and so on. Like, you know, talk about opportunity and crisis in that way. But it's important to be careful with the language. So we sometimes call it formative moments also. And another thing that we're doing right now is that we're also looking at multiple crises, because often it's not just one crisis that hits society. So we need to sort of see it as more of, we call it the anatomy of the crisis, or a crisis landscape. But the difference thing is that maybe from how we treated before as something that just hits us and have impact and ruin things for us when it comes to change making, etc. We can look at more strategically how you navigate this crisis landscape in order to achieve a transformation. For example, from fossil-based economy to bio-based economy, where we have a biodiversity crisis, we have climate crisis, we have the pandemic, we have a semiconductor, lack of semiconductor as a crisis for many. We had a spike in electricity prices in Sweden in December. It was a crisis to a lot of people. We have Ukraine crisis with oil and gas prices going up. So there's constantly things happening. I think you can think about what's going on at the moment right here in a certain context or a certain country. There are things that are more global, but there are other things that are more local, but still sort of can be seen as a disturbance. or a crisis. So right now we're together with Dark Matter Labs and Vinnova in Sweden. We're exploring this when it comes to this Swedish food system, and also going up also to the Nordic food system, but looking at then strategies for food system transformations in this context. Oh, here is some of the web material, but it's called the Rapid Transition Lab. And we're doing this together with Swedish food system actors. So we just had a meeting on Wednesday. And then as you also, a lot of you have worked with, and this is part of the systems innovation sort of canvas and things that are available on your webpage, is to see transformation both as this process of building, nurturing niches, and then expanding and embedding niches and having, if you call it, large-scale impact. But we talked about that we should maybe avoid the word impact. But how things go from small to big. I mean, that's part of the transition theory. But you also have this process then of phasing out and letting go, which I think is talked about too little, not in this community, not in this room here, but out in society. That we have to, a lot of times we talk about how we have to accelerate the transformation and scaling innovation more rapidly, etc. But we talk too little about accelerating the part of the system or the systems that needs to go. I think this is very similar also to the 3 Horizon, as many of you have mentioned and also is working with. And I just want to talk about a couple of sort of capacity building then, or capacity issues around that I think is interesting, and that I heard some of what that I heard you talk about today. So the hospice work I think is really interesting, and the Berkana two-loop model is one of the things on the SI webpage too, which actually talk about hospice. And I think it's a useful concept when it comes to talking about addressing what needs to go, and that we both have to be birth or midwives for what needs to be born and be created, but also at the same time we need to work as hospice workers then to let things die. And I think it's important also to let things die with dignity, and I'll have an example of that. Here's the Vattenfall, a Swedish company, but they own coal plants and other power plants around the world. And they just closed the last coal power plant in the Netherlands. And they did that together with the Dutch government. And they were paid to do this. And you can sort of question that. I just saw a number actually of how much it would cost to buy out the whole fossil industry. And it's big number. I can't remember exactly, but it's not like impossible. So, but that's what happened here. They closed earlier than they were required. But then what I think is interesting is how they did that. So in this case, they helped workers working in the plant with getting new jobs or getting reskilling, going through a reskilling program, and maybe an early retirement. But they also did this art installation. Henk Wildschut is the artist who did a video where he just sort of have people come into the room, stand there quietly, and then just leave. And then there's a new group coming, standing, leaving. And they show this a movie on the wall of the factory, for weeks, maybe a month before they closed. But it was a way then to recognize the people that have their identities, they have their income in this industry. And I think this is one of the most important work we have to do when it comes to hospice, is to deal with the grief. We often, in Sweden, we often talk about the grief that young people feel because the politicians don't take the decisions that they need to take. But there's also a grief of not being able to work in this plant anymore, and or to have this identity around coal worker. And of course, if you don't deal with that, that grief turns into anger, and anger can turn into hate, and hate very destructive force in society. So I think it's very, very important work in all systems change. I'm thinking also about changing the food system, more plant-based diets, etc. A lot of people feel grief about that, about not eating so much meat anymore. And we can say like, well, screw you, we need to change. But I think that those feelings are really important to take care of. And then I want to talk a little bit about capacities around the pushback that we can get from the system when we try to achieve system change and transformations. And we just had in Sweden, we had the Sami people have won a couple of court cases about hunting rights, etc., which is progress, which is the direction we should go. But of course, in that process, this is in Swedish, but it says racism, hate crime against young reindeer herders in Sweden. That has increased. And there's a lot of really awful crimes going on up in the northern Sweden right now. And it is a sort of a very common pushback when you start to challenge and change systems. So the Global Witness report is full of activists that are listed as being murdered every year for the work they're doing. So I think that it's also a very important aspect to bring up when it comes to capacities for change and how we talk about change, how we train change makers. Well, I do a lot of that, but at the same time, I'm very happy about that I can be part of those spaces. But I also have to think about what can happen if people become better change makers that also put them at higher risks. And that has to be sort of built into how we work with change makers and building ecosystems of change makers. And this pushback is I think from the system that needs to go. I think it's something is often missed when we talk about capacities. And again, maybe not in this room, but out there. And the thing that a huge role that we can play is to talk about these pushbacks and the capacities. So I usually use the democratization of South Africa as an example of talking about this pushback, because in 1990, the Clerk's government said, the regime said, we're going to let go. Nelson Mandela was released, and I see that as the sort of moving from the preparation phase and the movements trying to knock the system and shake the system and try to tear down the system, to moving into the navigation phase, a 4-year period where they wrote the new constitution. And in 1994, they had the new constitution, and they started, I would say, the stabilization process. And in those 4 years of writing the constitution, more people died in violent conflict than any 4-year period during apartheid. So again, it shows that kind of pushback that you can get when you're trying to take that big step, that maybe a crisis or a disturbance opens up. And it's important then to have capacities to navigate that. So in South Africa, for example, you have the truth and reconciliation work that helped sort of deal with that. And of course, many people talk about now that even though they did that transition, South Africa didn't end up in the sort of on the democratic path that was intended, because a lot of issues were left out of that process, those 4 years. But I think it's interesting with that capacity. What happens when that capacity is missing? When you're supposed to take that big step and navigate that threshold, moving over that hump that I showed you in the beginning. And Arab Spring is a good example that shows what happens when it's missing. So in all of the countries of the Arab Spring, the social movements were very successful of getting the regimes to step back. But then when they were going to move into the navigation phase, there weren't the capacities there to navigate it towards democracy. So none of the countries managed to move into a democratic state. They say that Tunisia was the one that came closest. But I think it's important also now when you have really strong social movements around the world, especially the youth, that I think are really successful to shake the system and getting some decision makers to actually think differently and maybe do things they weren't able to do before. But in that space, then we have to think about, do we have the capacity to navigate? Because what we see in South Africa, for example, is that a movement that seems like they're striving for the same thing actually starts to fight each other in that space of navigating. So that's when ANC split up also, and they start to fight each other. So I think it's an important message when it comes to who is doing what, when. When is the social movement sort of, when is their most important role? And when does other actors need to step in and to see that we have the capacities in the right place? And this is just to use the multiple basin of attraction again, that I showed you that there's one valley here, but of course then, like in Arab Spring, there are many different basins that it can roll into, and we don't seem to have the capacity here when it comes to navigating that space, but also navigating when the ball starts to roll rapidly, or fast into a new valley. And that's maybe also a critique on leverage points, because we focus a lot on leveraging change, making that stone roll. But what happens when it starts to roll fast? We just assume that it rolls in the right direction. So we don't talk so much about that capacity that we need when new feedback systems are rapidly forming. And I think that's one of the things that are happening with big companies now, because some really big companies, multinational companies, are the ones, if politicians in Sweden are not doing things, the big companies are. But that raises a lot of questions of who is in the driver's seat. So they have a very rapid development now in Sweden. But I wonder if we have the capacity to navigate that into stable states or trajectories that are the ones that we imagine in this room. So again, with the capacities. How am I doing, Joss, on time? Should I stop?
We took another 5 minutes.
Yeah. Great. So that's why I like I think all of you like Adam Kahane. It's a typical group that have read Adam Kahane and likes his work, because I think from what I heard, the discussions today, this is a really important sort of capacity. And we talked about collaboration for so long, but what I heard in the panel, for example, on building ecosystem of change makers, talked about that right now it's really important that we have collaboration methods that works when we can't have consensus. And I think Adam Kahane gives at least me hope, because I see a lot of situations now where it's opportunities or formative moments to take really big steps. And we can agree often that the system has to go, this system. A very left person can agree with a very right person that, yes, this system, that has to go. But of course, then when we try to take a step, then we sort of, it breaks on. So this is one of the most important capacities I see that we need right now. The ability to work in situations where actors are very, very far from each other. And usually, of course, it leads to polarization, as we see in society. And this is a way to still work with transformations in those contexts. Also, I want to also mention innovation and this, the sort of the how we think about innovation. For example, when it comes to climate change and climate neutral societies and transforming to climate neutral societies. There's a lot of work right now and a lot of positive work on the innovations that we need. And some big companies, for example, have identified that their most carbon pollution is in value chain, of course. So they have started to calculate, and they see like 95 to 99% of the carbon emissions is in our value chain. So they then start to think about innovations to deal with that. And then, so what we did in this study here, it's a report for SIDA. We took those innovations and we looked at them. What are the possible side effects of them and unintended consequences? And of course, with the circular economy or the mineral-based economy, it's going to mean more of the same and a really catastrophe for a lot of people. So if we're really good at this climate neutral transformation in Sweden, we might block transformations in other countries, in this case, the low and middle income countries. So this report talks about that transformations are telecoupled, that they are connected through our networks of trade and economic systems and also biogeophysical flows. We are connected across the globe. And we need to think about transformations in one place as connected to transformations in other places. And that we have to get away from this carbon tunnel vision, and you have probably seen this one too, that often when you see actions now, it's actions, innovations to deal with climate change. So single solutions to single problems. And again, as I said in the beginning, we really need to broaden. One of the strong sort of, I would say, natural, nature-related issues that comes up now is biodiversity, of course. So IPBES, which is IPCC for biodiversity, they have a huge effort now on understanding transformations in the context of biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis. And this is also something that was then brought up and related to this issue of introducing innovations and trying to understand what happens around the innovations that we propose now. And some of you have already talked about evaluation. I think it's a really interesting subject, and I worked a lot with Michael Quinn Patton, and who brought in the resilience ideas into this version of his developmental evaluation. And now with his latest book, even more on the social ecological systems perspective is part of that. And which I think then makes it a really, I think is a good evaluation method that not just promotes learning, but also address complexity and social ecological relationship. I just wanted to say that because I know a lot of you are interested in that. Yeah, I think I think I have to skip a couple. Yeah, so what I'm gonna skip a couple, but I have to sort of go through them. We can talk about them later afterwards. But I wanted to talk about one of the things sorry, this one, that to end on this, that one of the maybe frustrations or concerns that I have when it comes to systems innovation, transformation work is that it's focusing a lot on very small scale processes. It's a neighborhood or a community and et cetera, et cetera. And we can see transformational change at these levels, but we need to see them at the sort of the scales that matters in the Anthropocene. We have to see that the tipping elements, of the global, the Earth system is not showing negative trends anymore. It has to be happening at those very large scales. So I was just going to say that that's something that we're working on at the moment, is to try to understand how all these good things that are happening around the world having an impact at scales that matters in the Anthropocene. So that's why we use that concept of Anthropocene to challenge the whole field of social innovation and transformation, to think about how does their work relate to making change at these scales, and really trying to understand how we can scale out, up, and deep, and not just to get away from the sort of these sort of old scaling models, which is more of a diffusion of innovation, to more of these sort of more complex views on scaling. I think there's some promising work there. And last picture. So this is from April, a new chapter that we wrote when it comes to the capacities then for navigating large-scale sustainability transformations. And it's in this book, Applied Panarchy. And here, for example, we use the emergence of the neoliberal market-based economic system as an example, because you can think whatever you want about it, and that it's a toxic system, etc. But it's been very successful in how it has become globally dominant. So that's why it's interesting to study it and see how that emerged, because it is at that level that these issues of justice and sustainability has to happen. Otherwise, we will only be fiddling at the margin. Thank you. You can borrow mine.
Thank you so very much for just the layout of innovation from. Just casting that, that is becoming ossified. And that was the question that's resonated with me when I saw all these sort of came with that was, and I love that last slide, the evolution of social information. Are we in a time when we have seen that with this sort of preparedness and then one people prepare, like you get went to the Arab Spring, well, the mullahs prepared for it, and they sort of took the bounty, and the wrong people prepared. That's it. It's a position of preparation. And to overcome that, are we in a time where we have the possibility to overcome that and probably try a few different metaphors for what we're looking at? Metamorphosis, for example, looking at the garden, and then realizing that when it comes down to social systems, social ecosystems, get the notion already, that we are the garden and the gardener at the same time, like the caterpillar, not really having an idea that what kind of butterfly we may become, and to look from different angles, trying to always asking the entire question, what's wrong?
Yeah, but I love that question. The question, are you also, should I repeat the question?
Yeah,
Are you?
you put the mic on.
Oh, yeah.
I'd say it's getting to emergence, really, isn't it? Which
Yeah.
is what I didn't do the presentation, I guess. So,
Yeah, I clicked past that, sorry. The question then is, do we have other models that help us be less deterministic, I think, about sort of the path forward, sort of to allow emergence, to be okay with not knowing where we're going? I think that's a very important question. I think that I don't have one answer, of course, but I think it's super important that we stop thinking about roadmaps. I think it's useful. I had it in there because it's one of those foresight models, and I think the one that Bill Sharp talks about is the sort of the sort of situations when you have high uncertainty and high agency. That's when you have to have different models of foresight. For example, it talks about emergent pathways approach. But a lot of people then in those contexts used roadmaps, and roadmaps are good when you have high uncertainty and high agency. So, but they use it in that context that it's not where it doesn't work in my view. So it's basically having a roadmap where the next day, when you think you had the roadmap, one city has moved, one has disappeared. There's no road. It's like that's the situation I think we're in. So this illusion that we can pave the way into the future and then walk on it is one of the biggest problems, I think. So and just allow the transformation pathways to be created under our feet, right? That's really where we need to be, and have methods, thinking, etc. around that. So, and I can talk a long time about this because there's a I think a Greek word called aporia that is that state of not knowing, and I think we need to be more comfortable being there and stand in that and hold that space. Yeah, that's one of the capacities. I don't know if it answered your question, but thanks for raising that.
maybe it's like a roadmap for gardeners, right? The gardener doesn't know exactly what's the growth. They know spring sowing, they know something, general conditions, which
Yeah.
is what you're getting at there. If you understand the system, you can say, generally we're moving into a critical stage. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, right? Which is kind of, you're talking about phases, states, rather than this is going to happen or that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
can't repeat that to the camera. Sorry. But I can say one thing if I remember it when you read that poem. In Swedish, we don't say roadmap. We don't use road maps in this country. We use travel plan. I think that's better. I think travel plan is better, that you come up with a plan, for your journey, but it's going to change, but that doesn't mean that physical sort of roadmap.
I'm really interested in the inner capacity, capacity building part you mentioned. Never really let crisis wasted or let revolution be stolen. I'm curious how this capacity can be built, especially in the environment. There is a totalitarian government and super oppressive society. People have been taken away, their agency been taken away, even their right, the possible way of seeing the reality. How can you build capacity in this kind of environment? And you shared two examples that the revolution was kind of stolen. And can you also look from the historical perspective, what kind of revolution has been successfully established? So there is a new system, a new regime has emerged. And what can we learn from it?
Yeah.
How does system change work in dictatorship is kind of what you're asking.
Yeah. So one of the systems that we looked at was Chile, and the shift from a dictatorship to a democracy, and we focused on the fishery policy and fisheries in that, and the system that existed with Pinochet is an open access governance system where individuals took everything they could from the ocean to with a new government, a new fishery policy and laws that supported sort of a community-based fishery that built on traditional caletas. It's like co-ops. And so that's one of those, I think, often we look at, these sort of social political changes, but in relation to natural resource management. But I think, people here probably sit with a lot of these. But when it comes to the capacities, it's hard to have one answer. How do you work with these capacities? I think it's good that you raised that, because I already heard in your panel, for example, and in other discussions, how people talk about that, and just saying then that we really need to talk about it. Can I just say something? That one interesting sort of capacity then, and that is necessary, because as you said, there are marginalized groups in many places, and that you have those that are much more powerful, etc. But then sometimes these marginalized groups finally gets to connect with the power, etc. And it's really interesting to see, what can happen then, how that might be exciting for you as a change maker, because you haven't had that opportunity. So it's easy to step into that space and say and connect with that power. But that could also mean that is the switch when you're going from maybe having a disruptive idea and potentially be able to disrupt the system to become adaptive when the system is changing you more than you are changing the system. So I think it's really interesting that all these sort of capacities that has to do with what happens when you actually, in really difficult situations, starting to actually get some relationship and collaborations going between groups that haven't been collaborating before. but also what can happen in that context.
I think there's what's talked about how this morning, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of core to it, isn't it? So we know that's
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, is there one more question quickly?
Thank you for your talk.
Yep.
I was wondering, are you aware of the first 5,000 years of Egyptian civilization, of the matriarchy?
No. Yeah, I heard about it.
It's worth looking at. It talked more of cycles of time and art and magic, less of what happened when an end took over. And they sort of all disappeared in about 5,000 years. I don't know, it sort of feels held a lot. What you spoke about feels held in masculine.
How was that?
Just a comment.
How?
Held tightly in the masculine. And I suppose inviting the feminine side.
So, no, I didn't get that. Sorry.
I am inviting your feminine side.
Oh yeah, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks for doing that.
That's good. We still have